The Complete Personal Memoirs of Ulysses Simpson Grant. Chapter 4. Corpus Christi, Mexican Smuggling, Spanish Rule in Mexico, Supplying Transportation. Early in September, the regiment left New Orleans for Corpus Christi, now in Texas. Ocean steamers were not then common, and the passage was made in sailing vessels. At that time, there was not more than 3 feet of water in the channel at the outlet of Corpus Christi Bay. The debarkation, therefore, had to take place by small steamers, and at an island in the channel called Shell Island, the ships anchoring some miles out from shore. This made the work slow, and as the army was only supplied with 1 or 2 steamers, it took a number of days to effect the landing of a single regiment with its stores, camp and garrison equipment, etc. There happened to be pleasant weather while this was going on, but the land swell was so great that when the ship and steamer were on opposite sides of the same wave, they would be at considerable distance apart. The men and baggage were let down to a point higher than the lower deck of the steamer, and when ship and steamer got into trough between the waves, and were close together, the load would be drawn over the steamer and rapidly run down until it rested on the deck. After I had gone ashore, and had been on guard several days at Shell Island, quite 6 miles from the ship, I had occasion for some reason or other to return on board. While on the Suvia, I think that was the name of our vessel, I heard a tremendous racket at the other end of the ship, and much an excited sailor language, such as "damn your eyes," etc. In a moment or two, the captain, who was an excitable little man, dying with consumption, and not weighing much over 100 pounds, came running out, carrying a saber nearly as long and as heavy as he was, and crying that his men had mutinied. It was necessary to sustain the captain without question, and in a few minutes all the sailors charged with mutiny were in irons. I rather felt for a time a wish that I had not gone aboard just then, as the men charged with mutiny submitted to being placed in irons without resistance. I always doubted if they knew that they had mutinied until they were told. By the time I was ready to leave the ship again, I thought I had learned enough of the working of the double and single pulley by which passengers were let down from the upper deck of the ship to the steamer below, and determined to let myself down without assistance. Without saying anything of my intentions to anyone, I mounted the railing, and took hold of the center rope just below the upper block. I put 1 foot on the hook below the lower block, and stepped off just as I did, so someone called out, "Hold on." It was too late. I tried to hold on with all my might, but my heels went up, and my head went down so rapidly that my hold broke, and I plunged head foremost into the water, some 25 feet below, with such velocity that it seemed to me I would never stop. When I came to the surface again, being a fair summer, and not having lost my presence of mind, I swam around until a bucket was let down for me, and I was drawn up without a scratch or injury. I do not believe there was a man on board who sympathized with me in the least when they found me uninjured. I rather enjoyed the joke myself. The captain of the Suvia died of his disease a few months later, and I believe before the mutineers were tried. I hope they got clear, because, as stated before, I always thought the mutiny was all in the brain of a very weak and sick man. After reaching shore, or Shell Island, the labor of getting to Corpus Christi was slow and tedious. There was, if my memory serves me, but 1 small steamer to transport troops and baggage when the 4th Infantry arrived. Others were procured later. The distance from Shell Island to Corpus Christi was some 16 or 18 miles. The channel to the bay was so shallow that the steamer, small as it was, had to be dragged over the bottom when loaded. Not more than 1 trip a day could be effected. Later this was remedied by deepening the channel and increasing the number of vessels suitable to its navigation. Corpus Christi is near the head of the bay of the same name, formed by the entrance of the Uylsses River into tidewater, and is on the west bank of the bay. At the time of its first occupancy by the United States troops, there was a small Mexican hamlet there, containing probably less than 100 souls. There was, in addition, a small American trading post, at which goods were sold to Mexican smugglers. All goods were put up in compact packages of about 100 pounds each, suitable for loading on pack mules. 2 of these packages made a load for an ordinary Mexican mule, and 3 for the larger ones. The bulk of the trade was in leaf tobacco and domestic cotton cloths and calicoes. The Mexicans had, before the arrival of the army, but little to offer in exchange except silver. The trade in tobacco was enormous considering the population to be supplied. Almost every Mexican above the age of 10 years, and many much younger, smoked the cigarette. Nearly every Mexican carried a pouch of leaf tobacco, powdered by rolling in the hands, and a roll of corn husks to make the wrappers. The cigarettes were made by the smokers as they used them. Up to the time of which I write, and for years afterwards, I think until the administration of President Juarez, the cultivation, manufacture, and sale of tobacco constituted a government monopoly, and paid the bulk of the revenue collected from internal sources. The price was enormously high, and made successful smuggling very profitable. The difficulty of obtaining tobacco is probably the reason why everybody, male and female, used it at that time. I know from my own experience that when I was at West Point, the fact that tobacco, in every form, was prohibited, and the mere possession of the weed severely punished, made the majority of the cadets, myself included, try to acquire the habit of using it. I failed utterly at the time, and for many years afterward. But the majority accomplished the object and their youthful ambition. Under Spanish rule, Mexico was prohibited from producing anything that the mother country could supply. The rule excluded the cultivation of the grape, olive, and many other articles to which the soil and climate were well adapted. The country was governed for revenue only. And tobacco, which cannot be raised in Spain, but is indigenous to Mexico, offered a fine instrumentally for securing this prime object of government. The native population had been in the habit of using the weed from a period back of any recorded history of this continent. Bad habits, if not restrained by law or public opinion, spread more rapidly and universally than good ones, and the Spanish colonists adapted the use of tobacco almost as generally as the natives. Spain, therefore, in order to secure the largest revenue from this source, prohibited the cultivation, except in specified localities, and in these places farmed out the privilege at a very high price. The tobacco, when raised, could only be sold to the government, and the price to the consumer was limited only by the avarice of the authorities and the capacity of the people to pay. All laws for the government of the country were enacted in Spain, and the officers for their execution were appointed by the crown and sent out to the new El Dorado. The Mexicans had been brought up ignorant of how to legislate or how to rule. When they gained their independence after many years of war, it was the most natural thing in the world that they should adopt as their own the laws then in existence. The only change was that Mexico became her own executor of the laws and the recipient of the revenues. The tobacco tax, yielding so large a revenue under the law as it stood, was one of the last, if not the very last, of the obnoxious imposts to be repealed. Now the citizens are allowed to cultivate any crops the soil will yield. Tobacco is cheap, and every quality can be produced. Its use is by no means so general when I first visited the country. Gradually, the army of occupation assembled at Corpus Christi. When it was all together, it consisted of 7 companies of the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons, 4 companies of light artillery, 5 regiments of infantry, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th, and 1 regiment of artillery acting as infantry, not more than 3,000 men in all. General Zachary Taylor commanded the whole. There were troops enough in one body to establish a drill and discipline sufficient to fit men and officers for all they were capable of in case of battle. The rank and file were composed of men who had enlisted in the time of peace to serve for $7 a month, and were necessarily inferior as material to the average volunteers enlisted later in the war expressly to fight, and also to the volunteers in the war for the preservation of the Union. The men engaged in the Mexican War were brave, and the officers of the regular army, from highest to lowest, were educated in their profession. A more efficient army for its number and armament, I do not believe ever fought a battle than one commanded by General Taylor in his first 2 engagements on Mexican or Texan soil. The presence of the United States troops on the edge of this disputed territory furthest from the Mexican settlements was not sufficient to provoke hostilities. We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. It was very doubtful whether Congress would declare war, but if Mexico should attack our troops, the executive could announce, "Whereas war exists by the acts of etc.," and prosecute the contest with vigor. Once initiated, there were but few public men who would have the courage to oppose it. Experience proves that the man who obstructs the war in which his nation is engaged, no matter whether right or wrong, occupies no evitable place in life or history. Better for him individually to advocate war, pestilence, and famine than to act as obstructionist to a war already begun. The history of the defeated rebel will be honorable hereafter, compared with that of the northern man who aided him by conspiring against his government while protected by it. The most favorable posthumous history the stay-at-home traitor can hope for is oblivion. Mexico showing no willingness to come to the Uylsses to drive the invaders from her soil, it became necessary for the invaders to approach to within a convenient distance to be struck. Accordingly, preparations were begun for moving the army to the Rio Grande, to a point near Matamoras. It was desirable to occupy a position near the largest center of population possible to reach, without absolutely invading territory to which we set up no claim whatsoever. The distance from Corpus Christi to Matamoras is about 150 miles. The country does not abound in fresh water, and the length of the marches had to be regulated by the distance between water supplies. Besides the streams, there were occasional pools, filled during the rainy season, some probably made by the traders who traveled constantly between Corpus Christi and the Rio Grande, and some by the buffalo. There was not at the time a single habitation, cultivated field, or herd of domestic animals between Corpus Christi and Matamoras. It was necessary, therefore, to have a wagon train sufficiently large to transport the camp and garrison equipage, officers' baggage, rations for the army, and part rations of grain for the artillery horses, and all the animals taken from the north, where they had been accustomed to having their forage furnished them. The army was but indifferently supplied with transportation. Wagons and harnesses could easily be supplied from the north, but mules and horses could not so readily be brought. The American traders and Mexican smugglers came to the relief. Contracts were made for the mules at from $8 to $11 each. The smugglers furnished the animals and took their pay in goods of the description before mentioned. I doubt whether the Mexicans received in value from the traders $5 per head for the animals they furnished, and still more, whether they paid anything but their own time in procuring them. Such is trade, such is war. The government paid in hard cash to the contractor the stipulated price. Between the Rio Grande and the Uylsses there was at that time a large band of wild horses feeding, as numerous, probably, as the band of buffalo roaming further north was before its rapid extermination commenced. The Mexicans used to capture these in large numbers and bring them into the American settlements and sell them. A picked animal could be purchased at from $8 to $12, but taken at wholesale, they could be bought for $36 a dozen. Some of these were purchased for the army, and answered a most useful purpose. The horses were generally very strong, formed much like the Norman horse, and with very heavy manes and tails. A number of officers supplied themselves with these, and they generally rendered as useful service as the northern animal. In fact, they were much better when grazing was the only means of supplying forage. There was no need for haste, and some months were consumed in the necessary preparations for a move. In the meantime, the army was engaged in all the duties pertaining to the officer and the soldier. Twice, that I remember, small trains were sent from Corpus Christi with cavalry escorts to San Antonio and Austin, with paymasters and funds to pay off small detachments of troops stationed at those places. General Taylor encouraged officers to accompany these expeditions. I accompanied one of them in December 1845. The distance from Corpus Christi to San Antonio was then computed at 150 miles. Now that roads exist, it is probably less. From San Antonio to Austin, we computed the distance at 110 miles, and from the latter place back to Corpus Christi at over 200 miles. I know the distance now from San Antonio to Austin is but little over 80 miles. so that our computation was probably too high. There was not at that time an individual living between Corpus Christi and San Antonio until within about 30 miles of the latter point, where there were a few scattering Mexican settlements along the San Antonio River. The people in at least one of these hamlets lived underground for protection against the Indians. The country abounded in game, such as deer and antelope, with abundance of wild turkeys along the streams and where there were nut-bearing woods. On the Uylsses, about 25 miles up from Corpus Christi, were a few log cabins, the remains of a town called San Patricio, but the inhabitants had all been massacred by the Indians or driven away. San Antonio was about equally divided in population between Americans and Mexicans. From there to Austin there was not a single residence except at New Braunfels, on the Guadalupe River. At that point was a settlement of Germans, who had only that year come into the state. At all events, they were living in small huts, about such as soldiers could hastily construct for temporary occupation. From Austin to Corpus Christi there was only a small settlement at Bastrop, with a few farms along the Colorado River. But after leaving that, there were no settlements except the home of one man, with one female slave, at the old town of Goliad. Some of the houses were still standing. Goliad had been quite a village for the period and region, but some years before there had been a Mexican massacre in which every inhabitant had been killed or driven away. This, with the massacre of the prisoners in the Alamo, San Antonio, about the same time, more than 300 men in all, furnished the strongest justification the Texans had for carrying on the war with so much cruelty. In fact, from the time until the Mexican War, the hostilities between Texans and Mexicans was so great that neither was safe in the neighborhood of the other, who might be in superior numbers or possessed of superior arms. The man we found living there seemed like an old friend. He had come from near Fort Jessup, Louisiana, where the officers of the 3rd and 4th Infantry and the 2nd Dragoons had known him and his family. He had emigrated in advance of his family to build a home for them.